Hello, Internet. Dr. D here. Imagine the following scenario. You're a member of a trade union and your union is advocating for a minimum wage in your country, or maybe an increase in the minimum wage or some other worker benefit. And the big businesses in your country are lobbying the government not to pass any such workers' legislation. But you're doing a legal lobbying work, trying to get the government behind this. And then suddenly you start noticing people from the union are just disappearing, just vanishing without a trace, sometimes on their way to or from work, or perhaps in the middle of the night. And the families of the people who are disappearing are in a panic. They have no idea where their loved ones have gone. They contact the police and they're told, no, we haven't detained these people. We don't know where they are. There's no messages. There's nothing. And you begin to suspect that the government is kidnapping these people and just disappearing them because they're causing trouble. They're protesting against the government. But what can you do against this kind of tactic, this disappearance, if there's no evidence that the government is behind it?
A disappearance, also known as a forced disappearance, is when a government secretly abducts and detains a person. The prisoner is held without access to communication or legal representation. It differs from legal arrest in that the person's friends and family don't know or can't prove what has happened to the victim and therefore cannot use legal means to free them. It also prevents the prisoner from retaining legal representation so that the prisoner is completely at the mercy of his or her captors.
But why would you do this to someone? If they've broken the law, why not simply arrest them according to international standards of policing?
Disappearances are, ironically, an autocratic response to new standards of human rights behavior. Norms of human rights and acceptable behaviors were changing in the early 20th century, as was the public's ability to monitor and report on abusive behavior. Authoritarian governments realized that they could no longer abuse human rights without some repercussions, either at home or on the international stage. Therefore, dictators needed new techniques to deal with dissenters, techniques which could bypass legal protections without seeming to violate them and therefore dirty the government's image. Disappearances are how dictators up their game and try to stay one step ahead of accountability. What typically happens is that the government creates lists of dissenters. Journalists, activists, and opposition politicians are favorite targets. It then sends men out to kidnap the targets, almost always when and where there are few, if any, witnesses, usually at night. The victims are then taken into custody without any written record or communication. A variation on this is to arrest the victims legally, but then deny them their rights once they are in custody. If the family inquires after the victims, the police then say that the victims were already released when they actually haven't been. Victims may be interrogated or tortured or both. Almost inevitably, they are killed and the bodies disposed of. Disappearances are used because they relieve the government of certain problems inherent in autocracy. A government cannot be charged with war crimes or crimes against humanity if there is no evidence of a crime. Human rights organizations cannot agitate for a prisoner's release if the government will not even admit to holding the prisoner. The government can claim that the disappearances were the work of kidnappers or rebels, giving them plausible deniability and therefore protecting against international sanctions. Disappearances also create a climate of terror in the country, where people don't know if they will be the next to vanish without a trace. Yet, at the same time, they help the government maintain the appearance of democracy and legality because they leave no evidence of their crimes. Hitler's 1941 Night and Fog program, designed to kidnap lingering resistors to the Nazi regime, was one of the first known programs to use disappearances. The first widespread systematic use of disappearances was in Latin America from the 1960s through the 80s. Pro-US totalitarian regimes in Chile, in Central America, and particularly in Argentina, among other places, wanted to eliminate troublesome journalists and activists without being constrained by rule of law. However, if their image was stained by totalitarian behavior, the American people would protest, and the US Congress could perhaps withdraw financial support to those governments, something they could not accept. Therefore, as part of a CIA-sponsored program known as Operation Condor, they used disappearances to eliminate their opponents without appearing to do anything wrong. This occurred so often that a new verb appeared in the lexicon: to disappear someone or to be disappeared. And the tens of thousands of people who suffered this fate were known as desaparecidos, the disappeared.
Naturally, once tens of thousands of people who were opposed to the government simply disappeared without a trace, the Argentine people put two and two together easily enough.
In Buenos Aires, a group of mothers whose children had been disappeared held a protest in the Plaza de Mayo in April 1977, demanding the return of their loved ones, or at least information about what had happened. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo continue their annual protests to this day. And eventually, long after democracy returned to Argentina, hundreds of people responsible for disappearances were convicted and imprisoned. Unfortunately, international laws and treaties to combat disappearances have been slow to develop. The Organization of American States approved its Inter-American Convention on the Forced Disappearance of Persons only in 1996. The United Nations adopted the International Convention on the Forced Disappearance of Persons in 2007, after more than 25 years of development. And the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, the first universally legally binding instrument to prevent disappearances, went into effect only in 2010. Nevertheless, dozens of nations around the world continue to carry out disappearances, particularly during times of war or civil unrest. It would seem that the most effective opponents of disappearances are nonprofit human rights organizations. These groups publicize disappearances and attempt to shame the guilty governments. Sometimes the disappeared are released, but often it's already too late for them. If you believe that someone has been the victim of a disappearance and want to report it, the International Coalition Against Enforced Disappearances is a good place to find local, non-governmental groups which can help you. Failing that, you could directly contact the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and report the disappearance. I will provide links to these organizations in the description box below.
If you would like to assist human rights defenders in their struggle against enforced disappearances, best thing to do is probably check the websites of the large international human rights NGOs like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, and check their most current campaigns. I'll put the link in the description box below. See you next time.